Case 1. Richard William Matt. In June 2015, 2 convicted murderers escaped from Clinton Correctional Facility in upstate New York, using hacksaw blades that had been smuggled into the prison hidden inside frozen hamburger meat. The escape captivated the nation and triggered a 20-day manhunt that ended when one of the fugitives was shot and killed by a U.S. Border Patrol agent near the Canadian border. What made the story even more disturbing was the background of the man who had orchestrated the breakout. Richard William Matt was already serving 25 years to life for one of the most brutal murders in New York history. In December 1997, he had kidnapped, tortured, and dismembered a 76-year-old man, throwing the victim's body parts into the freezing Niagara River. The frozen meat that concealed the hacksaw blades was a grotesque echo of the crime that had put Matt behind bars in the first place. Richard William Matt was born on June 25, 1966, in Tonawanda, New York. He was abandoned by his mother and raised in foster care, where he suffered documented abuse. He dropped out of high school and began accumulating a criminal record that included burglary, assault, and rape. In 1986, he escaped from Erie County Jail, a preview of the escape that would make him infamous decades later. By his 20s, Matt had been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and displayed psychopathic traits. He worked occasionally as a day laborer and food warehouse worker, and he was known as a talented amateur artist. He was also widely feared in his community as a violent and unpredictable criminal. William Rickerson had spent his career as a food broker and businessman, building a respectable life in North Tonawanda. At 76, he was retired, married, and the father of adult children. Friends remembered Rickerson as a quiet, kind man who was enjoying his later years. He had once employed Matt at a warehouse, but he had fired him. That decision would cost him his life. In December 1997, Rickerson was elderly, trusting, and physically no match for the man who came for him. On a late evening in December 1997, Richard Matt and an accomplice named Lee Bates ambushed William Rickerson at his home in North Tonawanda. Matt had surveilled Rickerson's residence, planned the attack, and recruited Bates to help him. The 2 men forced Rickerson into a car and drove him around for hours, torturing him in the trunk and demanding money. Matt beat Rickerson with a pipe and eventually broke his neck. After killing him, Matt dismembered the body with a hacksaw. He threw the body parts into the freezing Niagara River and fled to Mexico immediately. The motive was financial gain and revenge. Rickerson had fired Matt from the warehouse job, and Matt had never forgiven him. Bates would later testify that Matt had bragged about the killing. Within days, a torso was found floating in the Niagara River by civilians. DNA testing confirmed that the remains belonged to William Rickerson. Investigators recovered a hacksaw and found blood in the trunk of a vehicle connected to the crime. Lee Bates turned state's evidence and told investigators that Matt had murdered Rickerson. Matt's sudden flight to Mexico raised immediate suspicion. What investigators did not know at the time was that Matt had killed again. In 1998, he murdered another man in Mexico, a victim named Charles Arnold. Matt was convicted of that murder and served 9 years in a Mexican prison before being extradited to New York in 2007 to face charges for Rickerson's death. The gap between the crime and the trial was 10 years. In May 2008, Richard Matt stood trial in Niagara County Court. Judge James C. Tormey presided over the 3-week jury trial. Matt was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. He pleaded not guilty. The prosecution presented Lee Bates as a witness, along with physical evidence that included the hacksaw, blood found in the vehicle, and DNA confirmation of Rickerson's identity. Prosecutors also introduced Matt's Mexican murder conviction, to establish a pattern of violence. The defense argued that Bates was the real killer and that Matt had merely been present. The jury did not believe it. On June 5, 2008, they convicted Richard Matt of second-degree murder. In August 2008, Judge James C. Tormey sentenced Richard Matt to 25 years to life in prison. Members of Rickerson's family spoke at the sentencing hearing, describing the horrific nature of his death and the agony of learning that his body had been dismembered and discarded like trash. Judge Tormey condemned Matt as a ruthless killer who deserved no mercy. Matt was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility to serve his sentence. For 6 years, he remained there without incident. Then, in June 2015, he and another inmate named David Sweat executed one of the most audacious prison escapes in modern American history. Matt had manipulated female prison workers, including a civilian employee named Joyce Mitchell and a corrections officer named Gene Palmer, into smuggling hacksaw blades hidden inside frozen hamburger meat. Over a period of months, Matt and Sweat used the blades to cut through steel and concrete. They escaped through a network of steam pipes and tunnels beneath the prison. A massive manhunt ensued. On June 26, 2015, after 20 days on the run, Richard Matt was spotted by a U.S. Border Patrol agent near the Canadian border. He was shot and killed. He was 48 years old. Richard Matt dismembered William Rickerson with a hacksaw and escaped from prison using frozen meat as a smuggling vehicle. The irony was not lost on investigators or the media. The case inspired the Showtime miniseries Escape at Dannemora, which chronicled the 2015 breakout and the investigation that followed. Rickerson's family received justice in 2008 when Matt was convicted, but the 2015 escape denied them the peace of knowing that their loved one's killer would die behind bars. Matt died as he had lived, running from the law, manipulating those around him, and leaving destruction in his wake. Case 2. David Paul Sweat. On the early morning of July 4, 2002, a decorated Broome County Sheriff's deputy named Kevin Tarsia was executed in Grange Hall Park in Kirkwood, New York. The killing was an ambush. Tarsia had responded to reports of suspicious activity and approached a parked car to investigate. Before he could exit his patrol vehicle, the occupants of the car opened fire. The motive was simple. The men in the car had just burglarized a gun store in Pennsylvania and were transferring stolen firearms when Tarsia interrupted them. Rather than face arrest, they murdered him. The man who pulled the trigger was David Paul Sweat, a 22-year-old career criminal with a history of burglary and property crimes. The murder of a law enforcement officer on Independence Day sent shockwaves through the community and triggered a massive statewide manhunt. David Paul Sweat was born on June 14, 1980, in Binghamton, New York. He had a troubled childhood marked by severe behavioral issues that led to placement in group homes. He dropped out of high school and began accumulating a criminal record that included burglary, attempted burglary, and property crimes. He had been diagnosed with conduct disorder and was known in his community as a juvenile delinquent. By the time he was 22 years old, his pattern of criminal behavior had escalated from stealing property to taking a life. Kevin Tarsia had served as a Broome County Sheriff's deputy for years. By July 2002, at 36, he was a decorated officer and a military veteran who had earned the respect of his colleagues and the community. He was engaged to be married, and his future was full of promise. On the night of July 4, 2002, Tarsia was doing his job, investigating suspicious activity in a public park. The men in the parked car were armed and desperate, and Tarsia was ambushed in the dark before he had a chance to defend himself. On the early morning of July 4, 2002, David Sweat and two accomplices burglarized a gun store in Pennsylvania. They stole firearms and drove across state lines to Grange Hall Park in Kirkwood, New York, where they planned to transfer the stolen weapons. At approximately 3 a.m., Deputy Kevin Tarsia spotted the suspicious vehicle and approached. Sweat and his accomplices opened fire before Tarsia could exit his patrol car. They shot him 15 times. To ensure he was dead, they ran him over with the vehicle. They fled the scene, burned their clothing, and buried the stolen weapons. The motive was to avoid arrest for the burglary. The crime was not premeditated as a murder, but the execution was deliberate and brutal. A passing motorist found Deputy Tarsia's body shortly after the shooting and called 911. Law enforcement agencies across New York mobilized immediately. The stolen firearms were traced back to the Pennsylvania gun store burglary, and tire tracks at the scene provided additional evidence. Within days, Sweat's accomplices were arrested. They confessed and implicated Sweat as the shooter. Sweat was arrested in July 2002 and charged with first-degree murder. Rather than face a jury and the possibility of a death sentence, David Sweat accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The plea allowed him to avoid execution, but it guaranteed that he would never see freedom again. He was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility to serve his sentence. Sweat was incarcerated at Clinton Correctional Facility for more than a decade without incident. But beginning in 2014, he began planning an escape. Over a period of months, Sweat spent his nights exploring the catwalks and pipe tunnels inside the prison walls, while guards slept. He mapped an entire escape route, identifying weaknesses in the facility's infrastructure. He enlisted the help of Richard Matt, another convicted murderer, and together they manipulated prison workers into smuggling hacksaw blades hidden in frozen hamburger meat. In June 2015, Sweat and Matt cut through steel and concrete and escaped through the steam pipes beneath the prison. A 20-day manhunt followed. Richard Matt was shot and killed by a U.S. Border Patrol agent near the Canadian border. David Sweat was captured 2 days later, also near the Canadian border. A New York State trooper shot him twice in the torso. He survived. Sweat was returned to prison and placed in 23-hour solitary confinement. All privileges were permanently revoked. His escape attempt resulted in sweeping security reforms across the New York State prison system, including the elimination of honor block privileges for violent offenders. David Sweat is 43 years old. He is incarcerated at Great Meadow Correctional Facility in New York, where he remains in extreme isolation. He will spend the rest of his life in a cell. Deputy Kevin Tarsia was engaged to be married when he was killed. His wedding never took place. A park and a highway in Broome County were renamed in his honor. Memorials to a man who served his community and died on Independence Day. Sweat destroyed that future to avoid arrest for a burglary. His escape attempt in 2015 bought him 20 days of freedom and a lifetime of solitary confinement. Case 3. Richard Lee McNair. In November 1987, an Air Force veteran and trusted police informant walked into a grain elevator in Minot, North Dakota, to steal cash. When 2 workers arrived for their shift and interrupted the burglary, the informant shot them both to eliminate witnesses. One of the men, Jerry Thies, a 44-year-old truck driver and father of 2, died from multiple gunshot wounds. The other survived. The killer was Richard Lee McNair, a 29-year-old man whose background gave no indication of the violent path he would take. McNair was the son of a reserve police officer and had served in the Air Force. He had worked as a police informant, a role that gave him access to law enforcement investigations and created a veneer of trust. That trust was shattered when investigators found him in possession of the stolen gun and items from the burglary. What followed was a conviction, 2 consecutive life sentences, and a series of escapes that would earn McNair a reputation as one of the most audacious fugitives in American criminal history. Richard Lee McNair was born on December 19, 1958, in Duncan, Oklahoma. He came from a stable middle-class family. His father was a reserve police officer, and McNair himself served in the U.S. Air Force. After leaving the military, he worked sporadically and eventually became involved in petty crime. He had a prior conviction for burglary before the 1987 murder. Despite his criminal activity, McNair maintained a relationship with local law enforcement as a police informant. He was highly intelligent and displayed narcissistic traits. He was also deeply deceptive, a quality that would serve him well in the years to come. Jerry Thies worked nights to support his family, splitting shifts between trucking and the grain elevator in Manhunt, North Dakota. At 44, he was married and the father of 2 children. He was a hard-working man who had no connection to Richard McNair. On the night he died, Thies was simply arriving for his shift when he walked into a burglary in progress. He was unarmed and caught completely off guard. In November 1987, Richard McNair broke into a grain elevator in Manhunt, North Dakota, with the intention of stealing cash from the facility. Jerry Thies and a co-worker arrived for their work shift and walked in on the burglary. McNair made a decision in that moment. He shot both men to eliminate them as witnesses. Jerry Thies died from multiple gunshot wounds. The co-worker was wounded but survived. McNair fled the scene and hid the gun and stolen items. The motive was to cover up the burglary and avoid identification. The surviving victim called 911 and identified Richard McNair as the shooter. Police moved quickly to apprehend him. McNair's role as a police informant had given him access to details of the investigation, but his erratic behavior and the fact that he was found in possession of the stolen gun and items from the burglary gave him away. He was arrested in 1988 and charged with murder and attempted murder. McNair was tried by a jury and found guilty on both counts. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences and sent to prison. The conviction should have been the end of the story. But for Richard McNair, it was only the beginning. In 1988, he escaped from custody using lip balm to slip out of his handcuffs. He was recaptured. In 1992, he escaped again, this time by crawling through a ventilation system. He was recaptured again. In 2006, McNair executed his most audacious escape. While incarcerated at USP Pollock in Louisiana, he hid inside a mail pallet and was shipped out of the prison. Hours after his escape, he was stopped by a police officer on railroad tracks. The officer had been alerted to be on the lookout for an escaped prisoner, matching McNair's exact description. McNair, thinking quickly, told the officer his name was Robert Jones and that he was out jogging. The officer, despite the fact that McNair matched the description perfectly, believed him. The entire encounter was captured on the officer's dashcam and later went viral. McNair talked his way out of the stop and continued running. McNair remained on the run for months. He was profiled extensively on America's Most Wanted. In 2007, he was captured in Canada and extradited back to the United States. The escapes had made him a legend among inmates and a source of frustration for law enforcement. The decision was made to send McNair to the most secure prison in the United States. He was transferred to ADX Florence in Colorado, a federal supermax facility where inmates spend 23 hours a day in soundproof concrete cells with virtually no human contact. Richard Lee McNair is 65 years old. He is incarcerated at ADX Florence, where silence is the only companion a man who talked his way past police will ever know again. Jerry Thies was killed because he showed up for work at the wrong time. His children grew up without a father because Richard McNair needed to steal cash and could not afford to leave witnesses. McNair's intelligence and manipulation earned him 3 escapes and a viral dashcam video. They also earned him a permanent home in the most restrictive prison in America, where he will spend his final years in total isolation. Case 4. Ralph "Bucky" Phillips. On August 31st, 2006, New York State Trooper Joseph Longobardo was ambushed and shot with a high-powered rifle while responding to a report of a suspicious vehicle in a wooded area in Pomfret, New York. The shooter was Ralph J. Phillips, a 44-year-old career criminal known as Bucky, who had escaped from Erie County Jail 4 months earlier and had been living in the wilderness ever since. Phillips had spent 20 of his first 44 years in prison for burglary and grand larceny. He was a survivalist with an extreme hatred of law enforcement and an anti-authoritarian complex that had driven him to flee rather than serve out his sentence. During his 5 months on the run, Phillips broke into dozens of hunting cabins, stole cars and weapons, and successfully evaded hundreds of officers in what became the largest manhunt in New York history. He also earned a twisted folk hero status among some anti-government locals who admired his ability to outsmart the police. That admiration evaporated the moment Phillips murdered Trooper Longobardo. The shooting turned the entire region against him and guaranteed that when he was captured, he would never see freedom again. Ralph J. Phillips was born on June 19, 1962, in Stockton, New York. He dropped out of school in middle school and began a life of crime that included burglary, grand larceny, and theft. By the age of 44, he had spent more than 20 years behind bars. He had antisocial traits and an extreme hatred of authority, particularly law enforcement. He was known in his community as a prolific thief and a skilled survivalist. In April 2006, while serving a sentence at Erie County Jail, Phillips escaped by cutting through the ceiling of his cell, using a smuggled can opener. He disappeared into the woods of western New York and remained at large for 5 months. Joseph Longobardo's infant son was at home when his father responded to the call in Pomfret on August 31st, 2006. Longobardo was 32 years old, a New York State Trooper and a decorated military veteran. He was married, and colleagues remembered Longobardo as dedicated and professional. He took his duty seriously. The suspicious vehicle he was investigating that night had been reported in a wooded area. Longobardo arrived with another trooper, unaware that Ralph Phillips had set up a sniper position in the trees and was waiting for them. Phillips had been on the run since April 2006. During those months, he broke into dozens of hunting cabins scattered across the rural landscape, stealing food, weapons, and supplies. He lived off the land, using his survivalist skills to evade detection. He stole cars and moved frequently to stay ahead of law enforcement. He became the subject of a massive manhunt involving hundreds of officers, but he remained elusive. Among some anti-government locals, Phillips became a folk hero, a symbol of defiance against authority. That perception changed on August 31st, 2006. Knowing that police were closing in, Phillips set up a sniper position in the woods near Pomfret. When Trooper Joseph Longobardo and another trooper arrived to investigate a suspicious vehicle, Phillips opened fire. He shot Longobardo with a high-powered rifle, killing him. He also wounded the other trooper. In a separate incident days earlier, Phillips had wounded another state trooper. The motive was his extreme hatred of police and his desperate desire to remain free. After the shooting, Phillips fled deeper into the wilderness. The surviving trooper radioed for help immediately. Shell casings were recovered from the woods, and the manhunt intensified. The FBI joined state and local law enforcement in what was now the largest manhunt in New York history. Hundreds of officers searched the forests and rural areas where Phillips was believed to be hiding. The folk hero status he had enjoyed among some locals disappeared the moment he killed Trooper Longobardo. The entire region turned against him. On September 8, 2006, 9 days after Longobardo's murder, Phillips was captured by Pennsylvania State Police. He had crossed state lines in an attempt to evade capture, but the net had closed around him. Rather than face trial and the possibility of a death sentence, Ralph Phillips accepted a plea deal. Federal prosecutors had threatened to pursue the death penalty, and Phillips pleaded guilty to aggravated murder to avoid execution. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 40 years. At the sentencing hearing, the judge called Phillips a coward for shooting men in the back from the bushes. Phillips was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility to serve his sentence. He was placed in extreme isolation, and all privileges were revoked. Ralph Phillips is 61 years old. He is incarcerated at Clinton Correctional Facility in New York, where he will spend every remaining day, knowing that his cowardice in the woods cost him everything the wilderness once gave him. A memorial highway was dedicated in Trooper Joseph Longobardo's name, honoring a man who served his community and left behind an infant son who would grow up without a father. Phillips shot Longobardo from a hidden position in the trees, ambushing him like a coward. The manhunt ended with Phillips in custody, but Longobardo's son will never know his father. A survivalist who spent 5 months living in the woods now spends his days in a concrete box, stripped of the freedom he killed to preserve. Case 5. Casey Cole White. In April 2022, a 6'9" violent felon awaiting trial for capital murder escaped from the Lauderdale County Jail in Alabama with the help of the Assistant Director of Corrections, a woman named Vicky White. The escape triggered an 11-day manhunt that ended when U.S. Marshals rammed the fugitive's car into a ditch in Evansville, Indiana. As police closed in, Vicky White shot herself in the head. She died from the wound. The man she had helped escape was Casey Cole White, a 38-year-old career criminal with an extensive history of violence, including home invasions, kidnapping, and attempted murder. The crime he was awaiting trial for was the 2015 beating and stabbing death of Connie Ridgway, a 59-year-old retail worker and beloved mother and grandmother who had been killed in her apartment in Rogersville, Alabama. White had allegedly been paid to murder her by a member of the victim's own family. The case had gone cold for 5 years until White, already serving a 75-year sentence for an unrelated crime spree, confessed to the murder in 2020. What made the 2022 escape so shocking was the woman who orchestrated it. Vicky White was a highly respected jail official with an immaculate record who liquidated her assets, bought an arsenal of weapons, and threw her entire life away for a man she had fallen in love with over the phone. Casey Cole White was born on August 20th, 1983, in Alabama. He dropped out of high school and began accumulating a violent criminal record that included home invasions, kidnapping, and attempted murder. He stood 6 feet 9 inches tall and was heavily tattooed. He had been diagnosed with intermittent explosive disorder. By 2015, he was serving a 75-year sentence for a crime spree that had terrorized his community. In 2020, while incarcerated, White abruptly confessed to the 2015 murder of Connie Ridgway. The confession reopened a case that had been cold for 5 years and led to new charges of capital murder. White was transferred to Lauderdale County Jail to await trial, and prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. Connie Ridgway was 59 years old when she was killed. She worked as a retail worker and was a beloved mother and grandmother. She was known in her community as a sweet and quiet woman who lived alone in Rogersville, Alabama. She had no connection to Casey White. The murder was a hired killing, allegedly arranged by a member of Ridgway's own family. Connie Ridgway was vulnerable because she lived alone and trusted the people in her life. She had no reason to expect that someone would pay to have her killed. On October 23, 2015, Casey White entered Connie Ridgway's apartment in Rogersville, Alabama. He beat her and stabbed her to death. After killing her, he cleaned the scene in an attempt to cover his tracks. The crime went undetected for years. Ridgway's body was found during a welfare check in her living room, and the case was investigated as a homicide, but no arrests were made. The case went cold. In 2020, White, already serving a 75-year sentence for a separate crime spree he had committed in 2015, confessed to Ridgway's murder. He told investigators he had been paid to kill her by a family member of the victim. He was charged with capital murder and held at Lauderdale County Jail to await trial. Prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. While awaiting trial, Casey White began communicating with Vicky White, the Assistant Director of Corrections at Lauderdale County Jail. Vicky White was 56 years old, a highly respected official with an impeccable record and decades of service. She had no prior disciplinary issues and was trusted implicitly by her colleagues. Over months of phone conversations, she fell in love with Casey White. She began planning his escape. She liquidated her assets, selling her home and withdrawing large sums of cash. She purchased an arsenal of weapons and a getaway vehicle. On April 29, 2022, Vicky told her colleagues she was taking Casey to the courthouse for a mental health evaluation. Instead, she drove him out of the jail and fled. The escape triggered a massive manhunt. U.S. Marshals tracked the fugitives for 11 days. On May 9, 2022, they located Casey and Vicky in Evansville, Indiana. Marshals rammed their car into a ditch. As officers closed in, Vicky White shot herself in the head. She died from the wound. Casey White was dragged from the car and arrested. Casey White was returned to Alabama and charged with felony murder for Vicky White's death. He was facing the death penalty for Connie Ridgway's murder, and the new charge added to his legal jeopardy. Rather than risk execution, White accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He dropped all appeals. He was sent to William E. Donaldson Correctional Facility in Alabama, where he will remain for the rest of his life. Vicky White's career, reputation, and life were destroyed. She died in service of a man who had used her to escape and who accepted a plea deal that ensured he would never see freedom again. Casey Cole White is 40 years old. He is incarcerated at William E. Donaldson Correctional Facility in Alabama, serving life without parole. Connie Ridgway was beaten and stabbed in her apartment for money. Her family watched as the investigation went cold, then reopened 5 years later when her killer confessed. They watched as Vicky White, a corrections official, helped that killer escape. Vicky White threw away her career, her reputation, and her life for 11 days with a violent felon. She died in a ditch in Indiana, and Casey White went back to prison, where he will die. The ultimate betrayal of trust came from a woman whose job was to keep dangerous men locked away. Case 6, Charles Victor Thompson. In November 2005, a death row inmate at the Harris County Jail in Houston, Texas, manufactured a fake identification badge inside his cell, had civilian clothes smuggled in, and walked out the front door of the jail past 4 separate security checkpoints. The inmate was Charles Victor Thompson, a 33-year-old man awaiting resentencing for the 1998 murders of his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend. Thompson's escape was audacious and shockingly simple. When a guard questioned him, Thompson pretended to be an annoyed investigator and complained about the jail's tedious security procedures. The guard believed him. Thompson walked out of the building and disappeared. The escape lasted only days. U.S. Marshals tracked him to Shreveport, Louisiana, where they found him intoxicated outside a liquor store. He was arrested without incident and returned to Texas. The brief taste of freedom cost him any remaining chance of avoiding execution. Thompson had been sentenced to death in 1999 for the murders of Dennis Haislip and Darren Kane, but his sentence had been overturned on appeal. He was back in county jail awaiting a resentencing trial when he escaped. The escape made him look highly dangerous and eliminated any sympathy a jury might have had for him. When his resentencing trial concluded, the result was the same: death. Charles Victor Thompson was born in 1970. By the time he was 28 years old, he had no major felony convictions, but he had a reputation as a charismatic and possessive man. He had dated a woman named Dennis Haislip, and the relationship had ended. Haislip had moved on and begun dating another man. Thompson could not accept it. Dennis Haislip was 39 years old when she was killed. She was a mother who was trying to rebuild her life after her relationship with Thompson ended. She had begun dating a man named Darren Kane, who was 30 years old. On the night they were killed, Haislip and Kane were asleep in bed in Haislip's home in Spring, Texas. They believed they were safe. They were not. On April 30th, 1998, Charles Thompson broke down the door of Dennis Haislip's home in Spring, Texas. He was armed with a handgun. He walked into the bedroom where Haislip and Darren Kane were sleeping and opened fire. He shot both of them. Darren Kane died instantly. Dennis Haislip was critically wounded and died days later in the hospital. The motive was jealousy, rage, and possessiveness. Thompson could not accept that Haislip had moved on, and he decided that if he could not have her, no one would. The crime was premeditated. He brought a gun, forced entry, and executed them while they slept. Thompson was arrested and charged with capital murder. His trial took place in 1999. The prosecution presented the evidence, and the jury convicted him. He was sentenced to death and sent to Texas death row. In 2005, Thompson's death sentence was overturned on appeal due to procedural issues. He was returned to Harris County Jail to await a resentencing trial. It was during this period that he executed his escape. While awaiting resentencing in November 2005, Thompson had civilian clothes smuggled into his cell. He manufactured a fake identification badge using materials available to him in the jail. He put on the civilian clothes and walked to the front door of the jail. He flashed the fake badge and began walking out. He passed 4 separate security checkpoints. When a guard questioned him, Thompson did not panic. He pretended to be an annoyed investigator and complained loudly about the jail's tedious security procedures. The performance was convincing. The guard waved him through, and Thompson walked out of the building. A manhunt was launched immediately. U.S. Marshals tracked Thompson for days. He was found in Shreveport, Louisiana, intoxicated and standing outside a liquor store. He was arrested without incident and returned to Texas. Thompson's resentencing trial took place after his recapture. The escape had destroyed any chance he had of avoiding the death penalty. The jury sentenced him to death for a second time. He lost all standard appeals. He was sent to the Allen B. Polunsky Unit, home to Texas death row, where inmates are held in 23-hour-a-day isolation in the strictest confines of the state's prison system. Thompson remains there, awaiting execution. Charles Victor Thompson is 55 years old. He is incarcerated at the Allen B. Polunsky Unit in Texas, where he spends 23 hours a day in a cell, awaiting the death sentence he has evaded for more than 2 decades. Dennis Haislip and Darren Kane were killed in their bed because Thompson could not accept that his ex-girlfriend had moved on. Thompson's charisma and manipulation allowed him to talk his way out of a jail and passed 4 security checkpoints. His freedom lasted days. Haislip and Kane never got a second chance. Thompson remains on death row, awaiting the sentence he was given twice. Case Saimwanth 7. Timothy Vale. In October 1988, a 20-year-old burglar named Timothy Vale broke into the home of Mary Kinkle, a 73-year-old woman who lived alone in Binghamton, New York. What began as a burglary escalated into rape a brutal beating and murder. Vale raped Kinkle, beat her, and suffocated her. He fled the scene and was arrested shortly after. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to 29 years to life in prison. He was sent to Elmira Maximum Security Prison to serve his sentence. 15 years later, in July 2003, Vale escaped. What made the escape remarkable was not just the audacity of the plan, but the fact that Vale had documented it. Over several months, he used stolen tools to dig a hole through the concrete ceiling of his cell and into the ventilation system above. He concealed the hole with a fake brick he manufactured from toilet paper, cardboard, and toothpaste, painting it to match the wall. He built dummy heads from paper mache and human hair he collected from the prison barbershop to fool the night guards. And he filmed a documentary-style video confession using a smuggled camcorder, explaining his escape plan from inside his cell. The escape itself ended in disaster. Vale jumped from the prison roof and shattered his spine. He dragged himself through the woods in excruciating pain for 2 days before being captured. The escape cost him his health, his privileges, and any remaining hope of freedom. Timothy Vale was born in 1968. By the time he was 20 years old, he had a criminal record that included burglary and theft. He was highly intelligent and deeply manipulative. Those traits would serve him in planning his escape, but they could not save him from the consequences of his choices. Mary Kinkle lived alone in Binghamton, a quiet elderly woman who kept to herself. At 73, she was vulnerable because of her age and because she lived by herself. She had no connection to Timothy Vale. She was simply in her home when Vale broke in. In October 1988, Timothy Vale broke into Mary Kinkle's home with the intention of committing burglary. What happened next went far beyond theft. Vale raped Mary Kinkle. He beat her. He suffocated her. She died from the injuries. Vale fled the scene. The body was discovered, and Vale was arrested shortly after. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to 29 years to life in prison. He was sent to Elmira Maximum Security Prison in New York. Vale spent 15 years in prison before attempting his escape. Beginning in early 2003, he and an accomplice began planning. Over several months, Vale used stolen tools to chip away at the concrete ceiling of his cell, digging a hole large enough to crawl through and into the ventilation system above. He concealed the hole with a fake brick he manufactured from toilet paper, cardboard, and toothpaste. He painted the fake brick to match the color of the wall. To fool the night guards during head counts, he built dummy heads from paper mache and human hair he had collected from the prison barbershop. He placed the dummy heads in the beds to create the illusion that he and his accomplice were asleep. Vale also filmed a documentary-style video confession using a smuggled camcorder. In the video, he explained his escape plan in detail, narrating the process from inside his cell. In July 2003, Vale and his accomplice put the plan into action. They climbed through the hole in the ceiling and into the ventilation system. They made their way to the prison roof. From there, Vale jumped. He shattered his spine on landing. The injuries were catastrophic. He could barely move, but he dragged himself into the woods, where he spent 2 days in excruciating pain. Authorities launched a manhunt as soon as the escape was discovered. Vale's dummy heads had fooled the guards for a short time, but once the deception was uncovered, search teams were deployed. 2 days after the escape, Vale was found in the woods, unable to walk and in severe pain. He was captured and returned to prison. The injuries he sustained during the jump left him with permanent damage to his spine and back. Vale was returned to prison and placed in the special housing unit, an area reserved for inmates who pose security risks or who require extreme isolation. He lost all privileges permanently. His body was destroyed by the injuries he sustained during the escape, and he now lives with chronic pain and limited mobility. His intelligence and planning had been meticulous, but his hubris cost him his health. Timothy Vale is 56 years old. He is incarcerated at Auburn Correctional Facility in New York, and his shattered spine ensures that every day of his sentence is a reminder of the roof he jumped from. His parole eligibility is decades away, and his escape attempt destroyed any chance of early release. Mary Kinkle was raped and murdered in her own home by a man who broke in to steal. Vale used his intelligence to plan a meticulous escape, filming himself explaining the plan as though he were creating a true crime documentary. He shattered his spine jumping from a roof and spent 2 days dragging himself through the woods. His body is broken, and intelligence could not save him from his own arrogance. Case 8. Sarah Jo Pender. In October 2000, a 21-year-old college dropout named Sarah Jo Pender helped her boyfriend murder their 2 roommates in Indianapolis, Indiana. The victims, Richard Hull and Andrew Cataldi, were shot to death with a 12-gauge shotgun during an argument over drugs and money. Pender's boyfriend, Richard Edward, pulled the trigger, but Pender had purchased the gun, bought bleach to clean the crime scene, and helped dispose of the bodies in a dumpster. She was convicted as an accomplice to murder and sentenced to 110 years in prison. Prosecutors described her as the female Charles Manson, a reference to her profound ability to manipulate those around her. In 2008, Pender proved them right. She seduced a prison guard and convinced a former cellmate to help her escape from Rockville Correctional Facility. She was smuggled out of the prison in a state van and remained on the run for 4 months. She was featured on America's Most Wanted before being captured in Chicago. 4 months of freedom cost her 5 years in absolute solitary confinement and destroyed any chance she had of early release or clemency. The escape also confirmed what prosecutors had argued from the beginning. Sarah Jo Pender was a master manipulator who could convince others to commit felonies on her behalf, without ever dirtying her own hands. Sarah Jo Pender was born in 1979. By the time she was 21 years old, she had dropped out of Purdue University and fallen into the drug scene in Indianapolis. She came from a middle-class background and was described as smart and ambitious, but her involvement with drugs derailed her life. She had no prior criminal record before the murders. Richard Hull and Andrew Cataldi were Sarah Pender's roommates in Indianapolis. Hull was 25 years old and Cataldi was 24. They lived in a household where drugs and money were constant sources of tension. Both men trusted Pender and her boyfriend, Richard Edward. That trust would cost them their lives. On October 24, 2000, an argument erupted in the Indianapolis home where Sarah Pender, her boyfriend, Richard Edward, and their 2 roommates lived. The argument was about drugs and money. At some point during the confrontation, Richard Edward retrieved a 12-gauge shotgun and shot both Richard Hull and Andrew Cataldi. Both men died. Sarah Pender had purchased the gun used in the killings. After the murders, she bought bleach to clean the crime scene and helped Richard Edward dispose of the bodies in a dumpster. Prosecutors argued that Pender had orchestrated the murders, using her boyfriend as the weapon. The evidence supported that theory. Pender was arrested and charged as an accomplice to murder. At trial, prosecutors painted Sarah Pender as a manipulative figure who had convinced her boyfriend to kill the roommates and who had actively participated in covering up the crime. They introduced evidence showing that she had purchased the gun and the bleach and had helped dispose of the bodies. They called her the female Charles Manson, emphasizing her ability to manipulate others into committing violence while maintaining a veneer of innocence. The jury convicted her, and she was sentenced to 110 years in prison. She was sent to the Indiana Women's Prison. In 2008, Pender was transferred to Rockville Correctional Facility. She began a relationship with a prison guard, seducing him over a period of months. She also recruited a former cellmate to help with her escape plan. The guard and the former cellmate agreed to smuggle her out of the prison. In 2008, they put the plan into action. Pender was hidden in a state van and driven out of the facility. She disappeared. A manhunt was launched immediately. Pender was featured on America's Most Wanted, and her face was broadcast across the country. For 4 months, she evaded capture. In late 2008, she was arrested in Chicago. She was returned to Indiana. Pender's escape had consequences that extended far beyond additional prison time. She was placed in absolute solitary confinement for 5 straight years. The isolation was total. She had no contact with other inmates, no privileges, and no hope of early release. The escape destroyed any credibility she might have had with parole boards or clemency officials. The prison guard who helped her escape faced criminal charges and lost his career. Sarah Jo Pender is 44 years old. She is incarcerated at the Indiana Women's Prison, where she is serving a 110-year sentence. Richard Hull and Andrew Cataldi were shot to death in their home and discarded in a dumpster. Sarah Pender used her intelligence and manipulation to convince a prison guard to destroy his career and a former cellmate to commit a felony. 4 months of freedom earned her 5 years of total isolation. The female Charles Manson label proved accurate. She convinced others to ruin their lives for her, and she will spend the rest of her life in a cell. Case 9. John W. Parsons. On April 21, 2005, a 34-year-old career criminal named John W. Parsons robbed a gas station in Chillicothe, Ohio, and shot a pursuing police officer to death. The victim was Larry Cox, a 50-year-old Chillicothe police officer who was responding to the robbery. Cox pursued Parsons on foot, and Parsons turned and fired, killing the officer. Parsons fled the scene and was arrested shortly after. He was charged with aggravated murder and held at the Ross County Jail to await trial. In July 2006, while awaiting trial, Parsons escaped. Over a period of several weeks, he had chipped away at the mortar around a concrete block in his cell wall, creating a hole large enough to crawl through. He concealed the hole with a replica brick constructed from materials he had in his cell: paper, cardboard, paste, painted to match the wall. He escaped through the hole and disappeared. During his 3 months on the run, Parsons displayed shocking audacity. He attended a local outdoor public festival, blending into the crowd despite being the most wanted man in Ohio. He was eventually captured sleeping in a makeshift shack. The escape had sealed his fate. Parsons realized that his attempt to flee had made him look highly dangerous, and a jury would almost certainly impose the death penalty. He accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to aggravated murder in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. John W. Parsons was born in 1971. By the time he was 34 years old, he had accumulated a criminal record that included burglary and robbery. He was a known criminal transient, moving from place to place and committing crimes to support himself. He had no permanent ties to the community and no legitimate means of income. Officer Larry Cox had spent years walking the streets of Chillicothe, earning respect as a veteran of the department. At 50, he was known as dedicated and professional, and his colleagues viewed him as a reliable presence. On the night of April 21, 2005, Cox was doing his job, responding to a robbery and pursuing a suspect on foot. The suspect was armed and willing to kill to avoid capture. On April 21, 2005, John Parsons robbed a gas station in Chillicothe, Ohio. Officer Larry Cox responded to the call and pursued Parsons on foot. During the pursuit, Parsons turned and fired at Cox, shooting him. Cox died from the gunshot wounds. The motive was simple. Parsons wanted to avoid arrest. The murder was not premeditated, but the decision to kill a police officer was deliberate, Parsons fled the scene but was arrested shortly after. He was charged with aggravated murder and robbery and held at the Ross County Jail to await trial. While awaiting trial in July 2006, Parsons began working on an escape plan. Over a period of several weeks, he used makeshift tools to chip away at the mortar around a concrete block in the wall of his cell. He created a hole large enough to crawl through. To conceal the hole from guards, he manufactured a replica brick using paper, cardboard, and paste from his cell supplies. He painted the replica to match the color of the wall. In July 2006, he crawled through the hole and escaped from the jail. A statewide manhunt was launched. Parsons became the most wanted man in Ohio. During his 3 months on the run, he displayed remarkable audacity. He attended a local outdoor public festival, walking among the crowd, despite the fact that his face was being broadcast across the state. He remained undetected. In late 2006, authorities located Parsons sleeping in a makeshift shack. He was arrested without incident and returned to custody. Parsons' escape had destroyed any chance he had of avoiding the death penalty. His defense attorneys advised him that a jury, seeing that he had escaped from jail while awaiting trial for murdering a police officer, would almost certainly sentence him to death. Parsons accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to aggravated murder in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The plea allowed him to avoid execution, but it guaranteed that he would never see freedom again. John W. Parsons is 53 years old. He is incarcerated at Ross Correctional Institution in Ohio, where he will never again walk freely among the crowds he once blended into. Officer Larry Cox was killed while doing his job, pursuing a man who had just committed a robbery. Parsons shot him to avoid arrest, then escaped from jail to avoid trial. He attended a festival, blending into a crowd of people he had terrorized. He was captured in a shack and forced to plead guilty to save his own life. Cox's family was denied the closure of an execution, but Parsons will remain in prison until he dies. Case 10. Hugo Marcus Selensky. In June 2003, police executing a search warrant at a property in Hunlock Creek, Pennsylvania, began digging in the backyard and discovered between 5 and 12 sets of human remains. Among the bodies were Michael Kurkowski, a 37-year-old pharmacist, and his girlfriend, Tammy Fassett, who is also 37. The property belonged to Hugo Marcus Selensky, a 30-year-old man with a criminal record that included bank robbery and suspected ties to organized crime. Selensky had been extorting tens of thousands of dollars from Kurkowski, who was involved in illegal pill sales. When Selensky decided to eliminate witnesses, he killed Kurkowski and Fassett, beating them to death and strangling them with flex ties. He buried their bodies in his backyard alongside the remains of as many as 10 other victims. Selensky was arrested and charged with murder. While awaiting trial in October 2003, he escaped from the Luzerne County Correctional Facility by rappelling from a 7th-story window using a rope made from bed sheets. During his brief time on the run, Selensky called a local television news station and gave a live interview, professing his innocence about the bodies found in his yard and openly mocking the jail's security protocols. He turned himself in days later, realizing the intense heat he had brought upon himself and his associates. He was eventually convicted in 2015 and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. He will die in prison. Hugo Marcus Selensky was born in 1973. By the time he was 29 years old, he had a criminal record that included bank robbery and was suspected of having ties to organized crime. He was a feared figure in his community, known for his involvement in illegal activities, including the sale of prescription pills. He was involved in an operation with Michael Kurkowski, a pharmacist who provided access to controlled substances. Michael Kurkowski was 37 years old when he was killed. He worked as a pharmacist and was involved in illegal pill sales with Hugo Selensky. His girlfriend, Tammy Fassett, was also 37. The couple was involved in Selensky's criminal enterprise, but they trusted him. That trust was misplaced. In May 2002, Hugo Selensky decided to eliminate Michael Kurkowski and Tammy Fassett. Selensky had been extorting tens of thousands of dollars from Kurkowski, and he determined that the couple posed a risk as potential witnesses to his criminal activities. He killed both of them, beating them to death and strangling them with flex ties. He buried their bodies in the backyard of his property in Hunlock Creek, Pennsylvania. The bodies remained undiscovered for more than a year. In June 2003, police executed a search warrant at Selensky's property. They began digging in the backyard and made a horrifying discovery. Between 5 and 12 sets of human remains were found buried on the property. Among the remains were the bodies of Michael Kurkowski and Tammy Fassett. The discovery triggered a massive investigation. Selensky was arrested and charged with murder. He was held at the Luzerne County Correctional Facility to await trial. In October 2003, while awaiting trial, Selensky executed a classic prison escape. He tied bedsheets together to create a rope and rappelled from a 7th-story window of the jail. He disappeared. While on the run, Selensky did something remarkable. He called a local television news station and requested a live interview. The station agreed, and Selensky appeared on air. During the interview, he professed his innocence regarding the bodies found in his yard. He openly mocked the jail's security protocols, describing how easy it had been to escape. The interview was broadcast live, and Selensky's audacity shocked viewers. Days later, Selensky turned himself in. He had realized that the escape had brought intense scrutiny upon himself and his associates, and he decided that surrender was the safer option. Selensky's case dragged through the legal system for years. His trial did not take place until 2015, more than a decade after his arrest. He was convicted of murdering Michael Kurkowski and Tammy Fassett. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He was sent to SCI Fayette in Pennsylvania, where he was stripped of all resources and placed under tight monitoring. Hugo Marcus Selensky is 50 years old. He is incarcerated at SCI Fayette in Pennsylvania. Michael Kurkowski and Tammy Fassett were buried in Selensky's backyard, along with as many as 10 other victims. Selensky called a television station while on the run to profess his innocence and mock the jail security. He turned himself in when the heat became unbearable. The bedsheet rope gave him days. The TV interview gave him notoriety. The bodies in his yard guaranteed he would never leave prison.